Hello and welcome to our third event in relation to Exodus 6:3 this week. This week we altered our format a little bit. On Mondays I go through the letters of a verse, so here is the verse we did on Monday. And then on Wednesday I do a podcast talking about Old Testament theology using the verse of the week as the launching off point. And then now for Friday we want to go back to the verse of the week and look at the grammar a little bit. So what you're seeing here is a copied version of BibleHub.com/interlinear. I just type in interlinear.org or interlinear.com. Anyway, I forget which one it is, but it redirects. And then you put in the verse, and here you have it. Interlinearbible.org. And so here's what comes up. This is the Hebrew text is in the middle. You have a rough translation, which of course goes from right to left underneath. You have a transliteration right above it that gives you a rough English equivalent to the Hebrew letters. At the very top, you have the Strong's numbers. If you click on these, it takes you to the vocabulary word. And then at the very bottom, which is what we're more concerned with today, you have this code. Interlinearbible.org has only recently added this code. And it's great because now we have free information out there to study the Hebrew Bible. Is it perfect? I wouldn't say it's perfect, but perfection is overrated. Most of life is not about perfection. In fact, perfection, perfection is the enemy of the good. I forget how the saying goes. It's much better to get something done, most of the time, than to get it done perfectly. And in fact, I have a saying, Erasmus wins. Erasmus rushed through the first widely published Greek New Testament, and he beat all of the kind of perfectionists in Spain. They were working on one. And I mean, the King James is based upon Erasmus's Greek translation. He did what he did, and then he fixed it later. I frankly think that a whole lot more would get done in the world with that approach. There is another approach. I've heard the saying, my dad sometimes quoted it. There were two sayings I have from my dad, that two proverbs that kind of are in competition with each other. One is, anything worth doing is worth doing right. That's the perfectionist. But then kind of in his last years, I remember my dad saying, it's good enough for who it's for. Anyway, so all of that is to say is this code underneath is not perfect, but it sure is a lot better than nothing, in my opinion. So let's go ahead and look at this. This first word, va'era, is translated, and I appeared, a good translation. And I want to look at this, break this down a little bit. So this is a Vav, Aleph, Resh, Aleph from Monday. Now, what Hebrew does is Hebrew scrunches the letters together. And you have these kind of meaning bits that are all crunched together. It's different from English, where we tend in English to separate most of the meaning bits into distinct words. But they kind of crash together in Hebrew. So you might call these little bits morphemes, little bits of meaning. So in this va'era, the vav there, which I've separated out here, is the word for and. So whenever you see a vav on the front of a word, now there are some exceptions, but most of the time when you see a vav on the beginning of a word, it's either the word and or but. It's a conjunction. Conjunction, junction, what's your function? Hooking up words and phrases and clauses. And so a vav on the front of a word, here's one. This means and. Where's the and come from? The and comes from the vav. Any more? So here, the vav means but. How do we know? Context. We have to use the context to determine when the vav means and when the vav means but. But in this particular word, and I think works okay. Now, vav is really a separate word from our perspective. From our perspective, the vav is a separable word. But the aleph is part of the word. The aleph this is a conjunction that's a different bit that can be taken off. The aleph here is more a part of the actual word, but it is a significant meaning bit. And so I've taken it apart. You know, some purist out there is going to be angry with me, but I think it'll help those of you who are just starting with Hebrew. The aleph basically means I in this case. And the aleph also indicates that this is an imperfect form. If we go back here, it says that it has a conjunction vav, or wow, depending on how you say it. This is a verb. And see this imperfect? That aleph, the aleph is first common singular. 1CS means first common singular. What that means is first person is the person speaking. And you can either have one person speaking, who's I, or you can have more than one person speaking, which is we. The first person singular is I. Now, the common means that it doesn't matter whether it's masculine or feminine. You know, for example, when I speak, I'm masculine, singular. However, in this particular ending, Hebrew does not distinguish masculine and feminine. So the common means it's common to both masculine and feminine speakers. So, and I, imperfect. Now, imperfect, when you begin learning Greek, a lot of times what they tell you is the imperfect means future. That's very imprecise, to be honest. That's not really very good. But you know, when you're a beginner, you learn things a little bit. It's kind of like what I was saying about something is better than nothing. It's better. Sometimes you can learn something faster if you learn it wrongly to begin with and then correct it, than if you learn all the ins and outs of a perfect first learning. And so the imperfect here is not future. It means incomplete. However, this idea of a consecutive imperfect, that's an old way of talking about it. And I know the really good Hebrew people are going to say, why are we using this resource? Just learn it, man, you know, or woman. But again, we'll get there faster if we go with what we have available to us. This is a converted imperfect, is what I would call it. And a converted imperfect, there's a long history to them. I'm not going to go there. But basically, a converted imperfect, which is a lot of imperfects with a vav on them, especially when you have a vav and a patak and a doubled letter. But if you've been following me a little bit through Isaiah, aleph is a guttural. It doesn't do doubling. So instead of having a vav, a patak, and a doubled letter there, it compensates because it can't double the aleph. It just makes a long patak, which is this kamatz, this vowel that looks like a T. So the beginning of this word tells me that this is a converted imperfect. And the converted imperfects actually are past tenses. The imperfect tenses, I've talked a little bit about if you've been following some of these videos. The perfect and the imperfect, they are a little bit nebulous with regard to the timing. The perfect really means complete, and the imperfect means incomplete. However, this converted imperfect, it is a past tense. Historically, it comes from a place before Hebrew existed. It's a past tense. And so this is indeed past tense. And the way that interlinearbible.org is going to tell you about that is by consec imperfect, imperfect, consecutive imperfect. But I'm going to say converted imperfect, which means a past tense. Okay, you see the nifal here? I've been using N in my language, the N stem. But basically, there's not much of a clue here that this is an N stem. The main clue is the sere here under that first performative. So remember how I was saying that a vav is, these two are different, even though there's stuff added on, they're different. We call this a prefix because you can really take it off. It's a separate word. But the aleph we call a preformative because it really does belong to the word here. So the and comes from the vav and the I comes from the aleph, and the was comes from the fact that this is the N stem or the nifal stem. And unfortunately, normally you would have a doubled aleph to tell you that this was a nifal stem. But alephs don't do doubling. It's not in their contract. But the N stem basically means that you make it passive. So the active would be, and I saw, but the passive is, I was seen. Or another way to say that is, I appeared, which is the way that Interlinear Bible translates it, and I appeared. That's a great translation, and I appeared. The word is, the fundamental three-letter word is ra'ah, which means to see. And you'll notice that the hay has been chopped off. This happens a lot with what we call third hay verbs. Third hay verbs regularly use the hay. And you say, what the hay? No, sorry, hope you don't mind me saying that. Anyway, the hay goes away in the imperfect very often with third hay verbs. So all of that is to say is that this, you never thought there could be so much meaning in four little letters here with some vowels underneath. But it means, and I was seen, or and I appeared. And how do I appear? Not I, of course, that we're talking about God here. And I appeared al Avraham. I appeared to Abraham. Al Yitzchak, to Isaac. Va'el, and to Yaakov, and to Jacob. So this is God talking to Moses here. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Ba'el Shaddai. El Shaddai, El Shaddai. So the ba here is a separable prefix, right? Well, it's a prefix that means in or with or by. So maybe it should be translated, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by El Shaddai. And El Shaddai, as we were talking about in our podcast on Wednesday, means something like God Almighty, God of the mountain, God of power, something like that. It seems to feature the awesomeness of God a little bit. So that's how, now of course we talked on Wednesday about the fact that Genesis does refer to God as, I'm going to say the name, I feel a little hesitant to say it, but as Yahweh. But I've argued, or my inkling is that is simply in the same way after the fact. So let's say that in my later life, I come to be known as the sword. Yeah, that's not going to happen. Anyway, but so let's say you were telling about my childhood, and you said, and the sword went to high school in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Was I called the sword when I was in high school? No, I wasn't called the sword. My high school track coach called me FS for false start because in my very first meet, second race, I false started. 330 hurdles. But anyway, so I wasn't called the sword in high school. So my personal opinion is that when Genesis calls God by his name, the Tetragrammaton, that is basically in the light of, in retrospect, that is, that at the time, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not know God by that name, that God introduced that name to Moses. That's my inkling. I think that's the inkling of most Old Testament scholars, although, again, there would be some who would disagree with that. Okay, so here, here it's a vav, and the but comes from the vav here, sharuk. I don't know why it went sharuk here, to be honest, because there are bump letters, bait, mem, and pay, bump, BMP, and a vav goes into a sharuk like this. It goes from v to u in front of those letters. That I know. Why it's done it here in front of a sheen, I'm not sure. But I'm not, I'm just going to keep going. But, so here it's being used disjunctively. Context is where we get that from. Shami, okay, so shame is name. That was easy to remember as a Hebrew vocab word. Shame means name, or my name is shameful. I don't know. No, that's not as easy. Okay, so the Hirik Yod on the end, E, is a sufformative. So we have preformatives like this aleph on the front. A sufformative goes on the end, and it means my. So my name. Or is it a suffix? Actually, let's call it a suffix here because it's a separate morpheme, isn't it? So anyway, but my name, Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, my name, Yahweh, not was I known to them. Okay, so Lehem is la, which means two, and hem, which means them, and it's been scrunched together. But let's look at this. I was known, and analyze it a little bit. Okay, so in this case, this had a form that looked like the imperfect tense. The imperfect tense puts different letters on the front, like an aleph for I. This is imperfect. This is the perfect tense here. And the perfect tense puts letters on the end. So the T on the end here is where the I comes from here. I mean, Hebrew's crazy, isn't it? It's like, it's a game. I'm playing a game. I just kind of learned to love the game, you know? Don't ask why. You'll go crazy. There are plenty of Hebrew students who are in, you know, kind of gone a little off the edge, you know, because of this. No, I'm just kidding. Because they asked why. Don't ask why. And so with the imperfect forms, they put things on the front. With the perfect forms, they put things on the end. And so the T here is the I in this form. Yada, in the middle there, is the word for know. Adam yadad his wife Eve, and that's one. Yada tends to mean a more experiential knowing than 4 + 4 is 8. You know, that's not the yada normal. You might say, well, why is it a vav here instead of a yod? I'm sorry, that's just what this is. So there's a whole stretch of learning Hebrew. The basics of Hebrew, it doesn't really take that long to learn the basics of Hebrew. But when you really start memorizing it, there's this thing called weak verbs. And here, I mean, I'm looking at 2 weak verbs right here. So verbs that end in a third hay, the hay gets chopped off. Verbs that begin with a yod, a lot of times the yod becomes a vav. I mean, who invented this? I mean, it's real fun, to be honest. It's a fun language. But there's all kinds of twists and turns like that. And if you're going to memorize, you're going to be able to recognize all that stuff. Then you've got all these weak verb, silly rules. It's fun. I mean, it's crazy, except on Tuesdays. Yada, know, is in the middle there. So I, known, I, and then the nun on the front. So this was an N stem here that would normally have doubled the first consonant. But in the perfect, the N generally puts an N on the front. So this nun on the front is an indication that this is an N stem. So instead of I knew, it's I was known. That makes it passive. The N stem, the Nephal stem, is passive. So if you go with the parts, was known I. That's where the pieces come from there. So the last part here is, so to read the whole verse, and I was seen to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob by El Shaddai. But my name Yahweh was not known. I was not known to them by that name. And so there you have it. There's a little bit of the grammar of Exodus 6:3. I hope I didn't fire hydrant you too much. The idea is, and I've taught Hebrew before with a book called Lasor. Lasor throws you right into Esther 1:1. And of course, by the end of the book, you've read all the book of Esther in Hebrew. And there's, you know, in the very early days of the course, you know, you have to do pastoral counseling because it's like, I don't know anything, I don't know anything, I don't know anything. But the thing about inductive learning is that all of a sudden there's a click. I mean, I don't know why it happens. I don't know when it happens. You go to bed one night and you wake up and click and you know so much. I prefer to teach inductively. It's painful, especially for the student that wants to know everything before they move on to the next thing. The hyper J hates learning inductively, but inductive learning is far more effective in the long run, in my opinion, than the piecemeal kind of approach that we J's like so much. Well, there you have it, Exodus 6:3. Next week, I think we're going to go into Genesis chapter 11 and look at Melchizedek. So that'll be fun. And Melchizedek, who is priest of El Elyon, God Most High. So hope you'll stick with us.